The unlikely journey. It was a bright, crisp morning when Angela Carter, a devoted single mother, boarded her first-ever flight in business class. The airplane cabin, bustling with passengers and flight attendants, hummed with the usual flurry of activity. Angela, modestly dressed in a simple but well-maintained blouse and slacks, settled into her luxurious seat with a mixture of excitement and discomfort. She had always lived a life of practicality, prioritizing her children's needs above her own desires. So when her son, Eric, a successful CEO, had insisted she take some time off to herself, she hesitated. Eric had worked hard to build his career and over the years had gained a great deal of success. But as a result, the distance between him and his mother had grown. He had often tried to convince her to relax, to take vacations, to treat herself. But Angela had always been the stoic mother, pushing through the trials of single motherhood with resilience and quiet sacrifice. She never asked for much and certainly never thought she deserved such luxuries. But this time, when Eric had surprised her with a first-class flight ticket, Angela had reluctantly agreed. She told herself it would be a small escape, a brief respite from the relentless routine of work, raising 2 children, and managing the house. She needed to show her son that she could accept the care he was offering, even if it made her uncomfortable. As Angela entered the plane, she felt a strange mix of gratitude and insecurity. The gleaming first-class section, with its wide leather seats, thick carpet, and extra space, was unlike any part of the airplane she had ever seen. She had flown before, but always in economy, surrounded by a crowd of people with similar modest circumstances. This, however, was another world altogether. The moment she stepped into the first-class cabin, she noticed the difference. There was an unspoken air of privilege that lingered. Passengers looked relaxed and at ease, almost as if they had claimed the comfort of this space as their rightful own. Angela felt like an outsider, but she reminded herself, this was Eric's gift to her, and she should try to enjoy it. She made her way down the aisle, looking for her seat. A flight attendant with a tight bun and a cool demeanor greeted her at the door. "Good morning," Angela said softly, offering her boarding pass with a nervous smile. The flight attendant, Lauren, glanced at the pass, then looked back at Angela with a subtle but unmistakable expression of disdain. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" she asked, her voice laced with condescension. Angela froze for a moment. She was taken aback by the tone, but quickly nodded and assured her, "Yes, I'm in 1A." Lauren gave an exaggerated sigh, as if Angela's mere presence in first class was an inconvenience. She took the boarding pass from Angela's hand with an almost imperceptible roll of her eyes. Angela felt a chill of discomfort spread across her chest, but she didn't want to make a scene, so she quietly followed Lauren to her seat. Lauren's dismissive attitude didn't stop there. As Angela settled into the plush seat, trying to adjust to the unfamiliar surroundings, the flight attendant disappeared to attend to the other passengers. Angela sat silently, feeling an invisible barrier between herself and the other people around her. The high-end clientele were engrossed in their phones, sipping champagne, and flipping through magazines. Angela, on the other hand, was still grappling with the feeling that she didn't belong. The flight had barely started, but she was already overwhelmed. She could hear the soft chatter of the other passengers and the clinking of glasses, but it all felt so foreign to her. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, especially not in a place like this. When she finally mustered the courage to ask Lauren for a glass of water, the flight attendant gave her a look of thinly veiled annoyance. "I'll be right back with that," she said in a tone that suggested Angela was asking for something far more difficult than just a drink of water. Angela leaned back in her seat, trying to distract herself with the view outside the window. The clouds were moving by quickly as the plane ascended, and she imagined that she was floating above all the troubles of her life, even if only for a few hours. But when Lauren returned, she handed a glass of water to a nearby passenger without even acknowledging Angela. Then she walked past her again, serving others without so much as a glance. The deliberate snub was enough to make Angela's face flush with embarrassment. The flight continued, and Lauren's behavior became more overtly hostile. She ignored Angela whenever she needed assistance, rushing past her with a coldness that stung. It wasn't as if Angela had done anything wrong. She simply wasn't fitting in the way that the other passengers seemed to. She was treated as if she were invisible, as if her mere presence in the first-class cabin was a mistake. And then, just as Angela began to sink further into her own discomfort, the unexpected happened. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" a deep voice asked, breaking her from her thoughts. Angela turned, startled. The man who had spoken was tall, with broad shoulders, and his posture exuded confidence. He was dressed in a sharp suit, but what stood out most about him was the familiarity in his eyes, the unmistakable resemblance to her son, Eric. Before Angela could process the situation, the man looked down at the boarding pass in her hand and raised an eyebrow. "Mom, is that really you?" Angela's heart skipped a beat. The voice that had spoken her name belonged to none other than her son, Eric Carter. It was impossible. How could Eric, the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech company, be here on this plane? And how did he know she was on this flight? How could he possibly have known she was sitting in first class, treated with such disdain? The flight attendant, Lauren, who had been snubbing Angela all this time, froze at the sight of Eric. A look of recognition flickered across her face, but it was too late to hide her obvious surprise. Eric extended his hand to his mother, and Angela could see the bewilderment in Lauren's eyes as she realized just who Angela's son was. "Mom, what are you doing here? I had no idea you were flying today," Eric said, sitting down beside her. And just like that, the entire atmosphere on the plane shifted. A mother's pride, a son's surprise. Eric Carter had seen his fair share of luxury in his life. As the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, he was accustomed to private jets, lavish dinners, and the world of high society. He wore suits tailored to perfection and traveled the globe for business meetings. But the one thing he never took for granted was the foundation that had supported him, his mother, Angela Carter. Angela had worked tirelessly her entire life to give him and his siblings every opportunity she could. Despite the financial struggles, the sleepless nights, and the weight of being a single mother, she had always put her children's needs before her own. It was a level of selflessness that Eric could never fully repay, but he had spent the past few years trying. He had pushed her to take more time for herself, to see the world, and to experience some of the comforts he had been fortunate enough to enjoy. He knew she had never fully embraced the idea of luxury, but he also knew she deserved it. When Eric had arranged for Angela to fly first class for the first time, he had hoped it would be a small gesture of appreciation. But he never imagined that it would lead to such an unexpected encounter. As soon as Eric sat down beside his mother, the atmosphere around them shifted. Flight attendant Lauren, who had been so dismissive of Angela just moments ago, suddenly stood frozen in place. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. She had clearly recognized Eric, the CEO of Vertec, the company that was revolutionizing the world of artificial intelligence and consumer electronics. Angela, on the other hand, still hadn't fully grasped what was happening. She turned to Eric, her expression a mix of confusion and amazement. "Eric, what are you doing here? How did you know I was on this flight?" Eric smiled, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes. "I was in a meeting in New York this morning. I had a break, so I checked your flight information. I couldn't believe you'd agreed to take some time for yourself. I had to see it for myself." Angela blinked in surprise. Her son was always so busy, so immersed in his own world. For him to track her down like this seemed out of character. But then again, Eric had always been protective of her, even if he rarely showed it. "I didn't know you were going to be flying, Mom, but now that I'm here, I'm not going anywhere." He chuckled, and for a moment, the tension that had been building in Angela's chest seemed to dissipate. "Well," Angela said softly, I was just trying to do what you asked. You always tell me I should take care of myself more, but I don't know. It feels so strange." Eric reached over and took her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "You deserve this, Mom, more than anyone, and I don't want you to feel like you have to justify it. You've spent your whole life caring for us. Let me care for you now, even if it's just for a few hours." Before Angela could respond, Lauren, still standing at the front of the aisle, cleared her throat. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I had no idea you were, the CEO of Vertec." Eric's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze sharp. "Oh, you didn't," he replied, his tone now icy. "Perhaps you should pay closer attention to who your passengers are." The words were direct, but Eric's eyes didn't waver. It wasn't just the surprise of seeing his mother sitting in first class. It was the subtle, yet unmistakable, prejudice he could sense in Lauren's treatment of her. He had seen this behavior before, though never directed at his mother. But he knew this world all too well, the one where people like his mother, hardworking and humble, were treated as invisible by those who were quick to judge based on appearance or assumptions. Lauren's face flushed with embarrassment, and she quickly turned on her heel, retreating to the galley at the front of the plane. Angela watched the flight attendant leave, the sting of the earlier treatment still lingering in her chest. "Eric, I didn't want to make a scene," she said, her voice quiet but firm. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. But it wasn't right the way she treated me." Eric's expression softened. "Mom, it's not about making a scene. It's about respect. You deserve respect just as much as anyone else on this plane. And more. You've earned it. But the truth is, not everyone will treat you that way. Sometimes, you have to stand up for yourself, even when they try to make you feel small." Angela looked at him, her eyes softening. "I don't want to cause trouble, Eric. I'm just so used to not being noticed, not being important enough for people to care." "You're wrong," Eric said gently. "You are important. And you are worth caring about." He paused for a moment before continuing. "This isn't about what people think of you. It's about what you believe about yourself." Angela nodded, but she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. For so many years, she had put her children's needs ahead of her own. She had fought battles for them, struggled through hardships for them, but in doing so, she had lost sight of her own value. She had spent so much time just trying to survive, trying to provide, that she forgot what it felt like to be valued for who she was, not just for the sacrifices she made. As the flight continued, Eric and Angela spoke more. Eric told her about the latest developments at Vertec, about the challenges he faced as CEO, and about his desire to make a positive impact in the world. Angela listened with pride, her heart swelling as she realized how much her son had accomplished. But she also shared her own stories with him, the small victories and the quiet moments of strength that had kept her going all these years. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the initial discomfort that had settled over Angela seemed to lift. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. She had spent so many years being strong for everyone else, but today she allowed herself to be cared for. And in that moment, she realized just how much she deserved it. Eric glanced over at his mother, a soft smile on his face. "I want you to know something, Mom," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I've been so focused on my work, on everything I've built, but none of it would have been possible without you. You're the reason I'm here. You're the reason I've been able to do what I do. You've given me everything I needed to succeed, and I want to give you the life you deserve, starting today." Angela looked at him, her eyes misting with emotion. "Eric, I don't need anything extravagant. Just knowing that you've made it, that you're happy, is all I've ever wanted." Eric shook his head. "No, you deserve more than that, Mom. You deserve to be celebrated, to be pampered, to know that all your hard work wasn't in vain." The plane ride went on, and as the hours passed, Angela felt a sense of calm wash over her that she hadn't known in years. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt seen. She felt valued. And most importantly, she felt that she was finally, truly deserving of the love and care that had always been given to others, but never fully to herself. And little did she know, this was only the beginning of a chain of events that would change everything for her. The unseen power. As the plane soared through the sky, the hum of the engines blended with the quiet murmur of passengers settling into their journeys. But in the first-class cabin, a different kind of tension lingered, a feeling that something, or someone, was about to change everything. Angela Carter, the quiet, unassuming woman in seat 1A, had no idea that the course of her life was about to shift in ways she could never have imagined. Her son, Eric Carter, CEO of Vertec, sat beside her, his earlier warmth offering a sense of reassurance that Angela hadn't felt in years. The love between them was palpable, a bond built on years of sacrifice, hard work, and the unspoken understanding that they were both products of each other's strength. But beyond that, Angela was beginning to understand something else, something far more profound: her own worth. Eric was busy reading through some documents on his tablet, but Angela's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't help but reflect on the strange sequence of events that had led to this moment, the flight she never expected to take, the subtle humiliation at the hands of the flight attendant Lauren, and now, the unexpected but welcome presence of her son, who was both a source of pride and a reminder of everything she had worked for. Angela had always told herself that she was fine with being the background figure in her children's lives, fine with staying out of the spotlight, fine with being the one who gave but never asked for anything in return. But the treatment she had received from Lauren stirred something deep inside her. It wasn't the first time she had been judged based on her appearance or assumed class, but in this moment, it was as though everything she had endured over the years, the subtle slights, the condescension, the invisible barriers, had suddenly crystallized into something she could no longer ignore. She glanced at Eric again, his sharp features softened by the dim cabin lighting, and felt a sudden surge of pride mixed with guilt. He had grown into a man who had everything he had ever wanted, and yet here she was, her life a patchwork of small victories and quiet sacrifices. How had she become so used to being overlooked? When had she allowed herself to believe that she didn't deserve the same respect, the same attention? Eric lowered his tablet and turned to her, his brow furrowed in thought. "You know, Mom," he said softly, "I've been thinking. You're always so worried about making sure everyone else is taken care of. But when was the last time you thought about taking care of yourself?" Angela's heart clenched. It was the same question he had asked her for years, but hearing it now, it carried a new weight. She had worked so hard to give her children the best of everything, to ensure they had opportunities she never did. But in the process, she had neglected her own needs. She had learned to survive, but never to thrive. "I don't know it, Eric," she replied, her voice shaky. "I've always just done what needed to be done. I never really thought about what I needed. There was never time for that." Eric reached over and gently took her hand, his touch reassuring. "That's exactly the problem, Mom. You've always put everyone else first, but it's time for you to think about you, to let yourself live the life you deserve." Angela swallowed hard, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. She had spent so long trying to be strong for everyone else that she had lost sight of her own dreams, her own desires. She had put them on the back burner, telling herself that it was enough to simply provide for her children. But as the years passed, the quiet bitterness began to creep in. She felt invisible, unimportant, like she was only as valuable as what she could give. As the flight continued, Angela found herself lost in thought, her gaze wandering out the window. She watched the clouds stretch across the horizon, a seemingly endless sea of white against a blue canvas. The vastness of the sky made her feel small, but in a way, it also gave her a sense of freedom. Maybe, just maybe, she could start to live for herself too. It was a few hours into the flight when the unexpected happened. The airplane hit an unexpected turbulence, causing the entire cabin to shake violently. The sudden jolt startled many of the passengers, and for a few moments, chaos erupted. Cupboards flew open, items tumbled from overhead compartments, and several people screamed in panic. But Angela's instincts kicked in. Her hand gripped the armrest tightly as the turbulence continued to toss the plane around, and she instinctively turned to Eric, her face tense with worry. "Is this normal?" Angela asked, her voice trembling despite herself. Eric's eyes were focused on the flight attendants, who were hurriedly securing loose items, trying to restore order. "It's just turbulence," he said calmly. "Nothing to worry about." Angela nodded, trying to steady her breathing, but the feeling of being out of control was overwhelming. The turbulence didn't last long, but the disorienting feeling lingered. When the plane finally settled into a smoother flight, Angela let out a shaky breath and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. Eric squeezed her hand. "You're okay, Mom. See, it wasn't so bad." But as the plane finally stabilized, Angela caught sight of someone that made her stomach drop. The flight attendant, Lauren, was no longer just a figure of disdain. She was now visibly shaken. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she fumbled with the drink cart. Angela, still reeling from the turbulence, couldn't help but notice that Lauren was now struggling, as if the stress of the situation had gotten the better of her. "Is everything all right, Lauren?" Angela asked, her voice soft but steady. Lauren shot her a glance, a mixture of surprise and shame crossing her face. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she took a deep breath and quickly averted her gaze, turning her attention to the other passengers. Angela couldn't quite explain why she felt this overwhelming urge to reach out. She had been on the receiving end of Lauren's cold treatment, but in that moment, she saw something different: vulnerability. The same kind of vulnerability that she herself had felt just moments before, when the turbulence had thrown her into a state of uncertainty. "Are you okay, Lauren?" Angela asked again, her voice gentler this time. Lauren paused, clearly caught off guard by Angela's kindness. For a moment, it seemed as if she might break down, but she quickly regained her composure, forcing a tight smile. "I'm fine," she said curtly, "just a little shaken up." Angela nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in that brief exchange. The dynamic between them, the power imbalance, the judgment, had changed. There was something in Angela's voice, in her willingness to show compassion, that had cracked the hard shell of the flight attendant's facade. Eric, watching the exchange, gave his mother a look of approval. He didn't say anything, but in his eyes, Angela could see the pride he felt. She was starting to change. She was beginning to realize her own power, not just as a mother, but as a person, as an individual worthy of respect and dignity. The rest of the flight passed without incident, but Angela couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. She had extended kindness to someone who had treated her poorly, and it had made all the difference. In that moment, Angela realized that the strength she had been searching for wasn't just about surviving the storms of life. It was about weathering them with grace, and knowing when to reach out, even to those who had once overlooked her. A moment of reckoning. The rest of the flight passed in a strange, almost surreal stillness. The turbulence had subsided, but the emotions that had stirred within Angela remained, rippling like the aftershocks of an earthquake. For years, she had lived in the background of her own life, quietly enduring and sacrificing, convinced that her worth was tied to what she could provide for others. Yet, in the span of a few hours, she had felt something she hadn't in a long time. A sense of personal power, a quiet realization that she had more to offer than just her sacrifices. She glanced out the window again, the vast blue sky stretching endlessly ahead. The clouds had parted, revealing a horizon of golden light. Angela allowed herself a moment of stillness, savoring the feeling of being suspended in this vast, serene space. For the first time, she didn't feel like a passenger in her own life. She felt like she was exactly where she needed to be, even if it was only for a fleeting moment. Eric had returned to his work on the tablet, but every so often his gaze would flicker to his mother, a look of quiet admiration in his eyes. Angela, for all her life, had seen herself through the lens of others, through the eyes of her children, her colleagues, the people who depended on her. But as she sat there in the plush first-class seat, with her son beside her, she couldn't help but wonder if this moment, this small act of self-care, was her chance to start seeing herself differently. It wasn't that she had neglected her children or forgotten her responsibilities, but somewhere along the way, she had allowed herself to become invisible. She had placed everyone else's needs before her own, convinced that she had no right to prioritize herself. Yet here she was, sitting in the lap of luxury, a passenger on this flight, not because of her son's wealth, but because of the life she had built, one step at a time, through blood, sweat, and perseverance. As if reading her thoughts, Eric finally set the tablet down, folding his arms across his chest as he leaned back in his seat. "You know, Mom," he began, his voice softer than usual, "I've been thinking about how much you've given up for us. You always put everyone else first. Your children, your job, your friends, your community. But you deserve more than just what's left over." Angela felt a lump rise in her throat. She had heard these words before, but now they resonated with a truth that she couldn't ignore. She thought of all the years she had spent just getting by, making ends meet, raising her kids, always struggling to balance work and life. She thought of the moments when she had sacrificed her own happiness for the sake of her family, and the times when she had pushed her dreams aside in favor of others' needs. "I don't know what you mean, Eric," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I've done what needed to be done. I've never really thought about what I want or what I need. It never seemed important." Eric looked at her, his expression a mixture of concern and understanding. "That's exactly the problem, Mom," he said quietly. "It's not just about doing what needs to be done. It's about living. It's about you, your happiness, your dreams, your goals." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Angela was still processing his words, her mind racing with the sudden realization that maybe, just maybe, she had neglected to live her own life. She had spent so many years doing what needed to be done, surviving the grind, that she had forgotten what it meant to thrive. "I guess I'd just never known how to live for myself," Angela said softly, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clenched tightly around the armrest. "It's always been about making sure the kids are okay, that we're taken care of, that we're surviving. But I never really stopped to ask myself what I wanted." Eric sighed and placed a gentle hand on hers. "You've given everything, Mom. You've raised us, supported us, loved us, and now it's time to take care of you. Not just as a mother, not just as a provider, but as Angela. You're allowed to live for yourself." The weight of his words settled in her chest, and Angela felt a pang of guilt. Could she really do this? Could she let go of the years of self-sacrifice and step into the life she had quietly denied herself? Could she truly be more than just a mother, just a worker, just a caretaker? As the flight continued, Angela found herself reflecting more on her own identity. She had always been so many things to so many people. Mothers were supposed to be selfless, after all. They were supposed to give until they had nothing left, and Angela had done that without question. But now, as the airplane soared toward its destination, she couldn't help but feel a stirring in her soul, a longing to rediscover herself, to remember who she was before she was anyone's mother or caretaker. But just as the realization began to settle in, the intercom crackled, interrupting her thoughts. "Attention, ladies and gentlemen," a voice announced, calm and composed. "We are currently experiencing some minor turbulence in the area ahead, and we ask that you please fasten your seatbelts." Angela's stomach lurched, but this time, it wasn't because of fear. No, this was different. There was something almost liberating about the sudden reminder that life, much like turbulence, could throw unexpected challenges your way. You could either buckle up and brace yourself, or you could take control and navigate through it with strength. As she tightened her seatbelt, a sense of clarity washed over her. She realized that life was always going to have turbulence. There would always be obstacles, setbacks, and uncertainties. But what mattered most was how she faced them, how she chose to live through them. She could choose to cower, to hide behind the role of the selfless mother, or she could embrace the woman she had always been beneath the layers of responsibility. Angela felt something shift inside her, a quiet but undeniable strength. It wasn't long before the seatbelt sign was turned off, signaling that the worst of the turbulence had passed. The plane began to smooth out, and the cabin once again settled into a quiet calm. The flight attendants returned to their duties, though Angela could see Lauren still avoiding her gaze. But this time, Angela didn't feel the sting. She no longer felt like the outsider, the invisible passenger in a world that wasn't built for people like her. She was no longer going to shrink away, to accept the dismissive glances or the passive judgments. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she belonged, not because of anything anyone else had done, but because she had finally started to believe in her own worth. The rest of the flight passed without incident, and by the time they began their descent, Angela was filled with a strange sense of peace. She didn't know what the future would bring or where this newfound confidence would take her. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to continue living her life as if she didn't matter. She was going to take control, to reclaim the parts of herself she had set aside, and to give herself the freedom to be who she truly was. And as the plane touched down, Angela felt a profound sense of readiness. She was ready to face whatever came next, not as the woman who had always been defined by what she could give, but as the woman who had finally realized her own power. A life reclaimed. As the plane touched down with a soft thud, Angela Carter could feel the weight of the world lifting from her shoulders. The noise of the landing gear scraping against the runway seemed distant, as though it belonged to a different reality. In this moment, suspended between the clouds and the solid earth, Angela felt something that she hadn't in years, a sense of possibility. She wasn't just coming home from a flight. She was stepping into a new chapter of her life. The quiet resolve that had begun to build inside her on the plane now felt more solid, more real. Eric glanced over at his mother, sensing the shift in her demeanor. Her posture had straightened, her gaze more focused, as if the turbulence they had experienced earlier had opened her eyes to something more profound than just the bumps in the sky. She seemed to be emerging from a fog, the kind of fog that had clouded her vision for far too long. "You good?" Eric asked, his voice laced with concern, though there was a noticeable softness to it. Angela looked at him and smiled, a smile that held a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I'm more than good, Eric," she replied, her voice steady. "I think I've been holding my breath for a long time, waiting for permission to live my own life. But I don't need anyone's permission anymore." Eric studied his mother for a moment, as if seeing her for the first time in a way he hadn't before. Angela wasn't just the woman who had raised him. She was a woman in her own right, someone who had lived through hardships, sacrifices, and battles, and yet was still standing, still fighting for the people she loved. And now she was learning to fight for herself. As the plane taxied to the gate, Angela's thoughts drifted back to the conversation they had had during the flight. She had always believed that her purpose was to care for others, to put their needs ahead of hers, to be the unyielding foundation that held everything together. But now, she saw how fragile that mindset had been. By constantly denying her own needs and desires, she had deprived herself of the chance to truly live. She thought about the years spent cleaning houses, working double shifts, all the while pushing her dreams to the back burner because there was no room for them in the busy, chaotic life of a single mother. She had been so focused on surviving, on making sure her children were fed and had a roof over their heads, that she forgot to ask herself what she wanted. What did she long for? What did she need to feel whole? The questions lingered in her mind as the plane came to a complete stop at the gate. She felt a stirring in her chest, a feeling that for the first time in years, She was finally ready to answer those questions. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew she had to start somewhere. She needed to reclaim her life, to reclaim herself. 2 weeks later, Angela stood at the window of her modest apartment, looking out over the city below. The view was nothing like the sweeping vistas of the wealthy neighborhood she had seen on the flight, but it was hers. This was her life. This little apartment, these humble surroundings. And for the first time, she felt at peace with it. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind. After the flight, Eric had insisted that they take a few days to spend together, catching up and simply enjoying each other's company. But the conversations had gone beyond just family updates. Eric had pushed Angela to think about herself in ways she never had. He'd asked her questions, probing deeper than she was used to, encouraging her to pursue things that had always felt out of reach. "What do you love to do, Mom? What makes you happy?" Eric had asked one evening over dinner. Angela had been stumped at first. She had never thought to ask herself such a question. Happiness had always seemed like a luxury, something reserved for other people. But over the next few days, as they talked, she began to realize something important. She didn't have to continue living in survival mode. She had the right to want things for herself, to take time for her own growth, to chase her own dreams. Her first step toward this new chapter had been to take a day for herself. No work, no errands, no responsibilities. Just her. She'd taken a long walk in the park, something so simple, yet so foreign. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe deeply without guilt, without the weight of 1,000 obligations pressing down on her. That day had led to others. She had started taking small classes at a local community center, painting, writing, yoga. Each new step felt like a reclamation of something she had long buried. It wasn't about achieving anything extraordinary, but rather about rediscovering the things that had once brought her joy before life's demands took over. But it wasn't just about personal growth. Angela knew that her journey also had to involve confronting the parts of herself that had been silenced. She had to come to terms with the years of quiet humiliation, the unspoken injustices she had tolerated without protest. It had been too easy to let those moments slide, to tell herself that it wasn't worth the fight, that she was being too sensitive. But now, she understood that those moments of disrespect had built up over time, creating an undercurrent of resentment that had shaped her behavior. One of the biggest lessons she had learned from the flight, from the turbulence, and from her time with Eric, was that standing up for yourself wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Angela knew that if she wanted to be the best version of herself, she had to stop letting others define her. She had to stop allowing the world to treat her as if she were invisible. The call. It was late afternoon when Angela's phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID and saw a number she didn't recognize. Hesitating for a moment, she answered. "Hello, Miss Carter." The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. "This is Lauren, the flight attendant you met on your recent flight with us. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Angela blinked in surprise. "Lauren," she repeated. "The flight attendant." "Yes, Mom," Lauren responded, her tone a bit more subdued now, as if she were choosing her words carefully. "I wanted to reach out and apologize for my behavior during the flight. I acted in a way that wasn't right, and I've been thinking about it ever since. I wanted to say that I'm sorry for treating you the way I did." Angela's mind raced. She hadn't expected this. After all, the flight had been over 2 weeks ago, and she hadn't given it much thought since then. She had let go of the anger, the sting of Lauren's earlier dismissiveness, but now that it was being acknowledged, she wasn't sure how to respond. "Thank you," Angela said slowly. I appreciate that. It's not easy to admit when you've been wrong." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and then Lauren spoke again. "I didn't realize the effect my actions were having on you at the time. I was so caught up in my own assumptions, in judging you based on what I thought I saw, instead of taking the time to understand you as a person. And for that, I am truly sorry." Angela exhaled deeply, the weight of the apology settling in. She had spent so many years hiding from these kinds of confrontations, brushing off the injustices, convinced that peace meant accepting others' behavior without question. But now she saw this apology for what it was, a chance for her to reclaim yet another piece of herself. "Thank you," Angela said again, her voice soft but firm. "I accept your apology, and I hope that you'll take this as a lesson as well. We all have the power to change, to be better." As she hung up the phone, Angela sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the significance of what had just happened. It wasn't just about an apology from someone who had wronged her. It was a symbol of everything she had been learning. She didn't have to accept mistreatment. She didn't have to remain silent in the face of disrespect. She could stand up for herself, for her dignity, and for her worth. For the first time in a long time, Angela felt truly free. A new dawn. Angela sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of herbal tea in her hands, watching the sunlight filter through the window. It was early morning, and the world outside was just beginning to stir. The streets were empty, save for the occasional jogger or early-rising delivery truck. Her apartment, though small, felt like a sanctuary now. The clutter was gone, and in its place, there was a quiet order, an echo of the clarity she'd begun to find within herself over the past several weeks. Since her conversation with Lauren, Angela had continued to reflect on her journey. What had started as a simple act of kindness, a mother accepting her son's offer to take a break from her routine, had turned into a life-altering experience. The flight that had felt like a brief escape had become the catalyst for change, forcing Angela to confront the years of self-neglect, sacrifice, and quiet suffering she'd allowed to define her life. She had learned that standing up for herself didn't just involve confronting others. It also meant confronting the narratives she had internalized about her worth. For so long, Angela had believed that her value came from how much she could give to others, how much she could endure for the sake of her family. But now she saw that she was worthy, not because of what she could do for people, but because of who she was in and of herself. Over the past 2 weeks, Angela had taken real steps toward change. She had continued attending her classes, painting, writing, and yoga. She found solace in these moments of creativity and self-expression. The joy of learning new things, of exploring her own potential, was unlike anything she had experienced in years. For the first time, she felt like she was truly living, not just surviving. But it wasn't just the internal shift that had been transformative. Angela had started to see her relationships in a new light as well. She had reconnected with old friends, ones she had neglected over the years in the name of work and family obligations. They had met for coffee, shared stories, and laughed together. Angela had realized that there was a whole part of her life she had abandoned, the part that had been eager to connect with others, to build friendships and bonds that nourished her soul. She had let the business of her responsibilities drown out that need, but now she was rediscovering how to nurture those relationships, to give and receive in ways that honored her own well-being. A shift in perspective. It was early afternoon when Eric called. Angela had been reading a book on personal development, something that had been sitting on her shelf for years, but which she had never found time to read. As soon as she answered the phone, Eric's voice was full of excitement. "Mom, you're not going to believe this, but I have an idea," he began, his tone eager. "There's a big conference coming up for business leaders in the city, and I was thinking it would be amazing if you came with me. It's all about empowerment, especially for women, and I think it would be a perfect fit for you. You could share your story, your journey, your perspective on resilience." Angela's heart skipped a beat. She'd never imagined speaking at such an event, let alone being invited by her own son. The thought of standing in front of a crowd of influential people, men and women who had achieved success in the corporate world, was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Eric, I don't know," Angela said, hesitating. "I mean, what would I even say? I'm not a businesswoman. I don't have that kind of experience." "Mom, that's the point," Eric replied, his voice calm but persuasive. Your experience is exactly what people need to hear. You've lived a life that a lot of people can relate to. The struggles, the sacrifices, the perseverance. People need to hear your story. It's not about having a title or a fancy career. It's about your journey, your resilience, and what you've overcome. That's what makes you an inspiration. Angela felt her stomach twist. The idea of being in the spotlight, of sharing her story in front of a crowd, was overwhelming. But as she thought about it, she couldn't deny the truth in Eric's words. She had lived a life full of challenges she had faced head-on, with no other choice but to keep going. Maybe this was the moment to share those experiences, to use them as a source of strength, not just for herself, but for others as well. Taking a deep breath, Angela finally replied, "Okay, I'll do it." The speech. A week later, Angela found herself standing backstage at the conference venue, her heart pounding in her chest. The event was being held in a grand ballroom in the city's downtown district. Hundreds of people were milling about in the lobby, preparing for the day's sessions. The air was charged with energy, and Angela felt out of place. She was just a single mother from a modest background. These were high-powered executives, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders. But as she stood there, looking out at the crowd through the curtain, something inside her clicked. She wasn't just a single mother. She wasn't just a worker or a caretaker. She was Angela Carter, a woman who had fought through adversity, who had raised children alone, who had learned to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. When her name was called, Angela took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped onto the stage. The spotlight was blinding, and for a moment, the world seemed to disappear. But as she looked out at the crowd, she saw something unexpected, a sea of faces that were waiting for her to speak. There was no judgment in their eyes, no doubt, only anticipation. Taking another breath, Angela began. "I've spent most of my life putting others first," she began, her voice steady but warm. "I've been a mother, a worker, a caretaker, and a friend. But there came a time when I realized that I had been so focused on serving others that I had forgotten to serve myself." Her words rang out clearly, the truth in them echoing through the room. "I spent years thinking that my worth was tied to what I could give, how much I could endure. I thought that by sacrificing everything, I would be valued. But I was wrong. True strength doesn't come from giving until you're empty. It comes from knowing when to stop, to take care of yourself, to find joy in your own life." Angela paused for a moment, looking out at the crowd. She saw faces, some of them familiar, some of them strangers, nodding in agreement. For the first time in her life, Angela felt like she wasn't alone. She wasn't the only one who had struggled, who had put others first at the expense of their own happiness. This room was filled with people who had their own stories, their own journeys, and their own battles. "You see," she continued, "I've learned that it's never too late to change. It's never too late to reclaim your life, your worth, and your happiness. We don't need to wait for permission from anyone. We are all worthy of living our lives fully, of putting ourselves first sometimes, not out of selfishness, but because we matter. Our dreams matter." The room was silent now, everyone hanging on her words. Angela spoke with a quiet passion, the same quiet strength that had carried her through the years. She wasn't just telling her story, she was inspiring others to reclaim their own. As she finished, the applause that followed was not just for her words, but for the strength and vulnerability she had shared. Angela had stepped onto that stage as a mother, yes, but she had left it as something far more powerful, a woman who had taken control of her own destiny. The next chapter. The standing ovation felt like the culmination of everything Angela had worked for, the culmination of every sacrifice, every struggle, every quiet moment of self-doubt. But as she walked off that stage, she knew that the journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. That evening, as she sat in her hotel room, reflecting on the day, Angela smiled. She had found her voice. She had found her strength. And now she was ready to share it with the world. The woman who had once believed she wasn't worthy of anything more than survival had now become the woman who was ready to live fully. The sun was setting outside her window, casting a warm, golden light across the skyline. Angela knew that this was just the beginning. A new chapter, full of possibilities, full of hope. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to embrace it.